first two modules, we talked about the P&L and then the value drivers. Both of those were really to help you understand pain and urgency to go and engage executives at a higher level, talking about the business problems that they're facing. In this module, we're going to be looking at executive compensation and how you can understand the incentives of the key executives at your target customers organization. Not only are you talking about the areas of pain and urgency in their business, but you're talking exactly in the terms that they care about the most. The idea of executive compensation is it aligns an organization around the priorities of their business with the financials of how they run it. We're going to leave you with more details around the DEF 14A, or what we call the proxy statement, and a better understanding around how you can read that to understand the opportunity. So let's start with a bit of background here. Why is this important? Well, a couple of years ago, I was listening to a podcast, and there was a sales executive who was coming onto the podcast talking about a particular deal that he had won. He was obviously being called on because he had been highly successful. He structured a $21 million deal with IBM. Well, okay, it's $21 million because it's IBM and because they're big. Well, maybe, but the other part of that was actually he'd typically only ever done $300,000 deals until that point in his career. And suddenly he gets this extraordinarily large, big deal. When you listen to him and he talks about how he got there, it was really because he had understood how executives at the company were being paid. And it may sound simple, but one of the key metrics that they were being measured on was revenue growth, just simply growth. They had 19 straight quarters of revenue decline. They were losing money quarter over quarter for many years. And he targeted that same message into his software sale so that he could make sure he was aligned to the company strategy, to the executives' incentives, and that helped him to go and gain consensus across a large number of stakeholders, and that drove a mega deal for him and the largest deal in his company's history. So let's see how we can do that with you and for your customers as well. First of all, a bit of background into executive compensation. Back in, say, the 1970s, 1980s, actually, pay for executives hadn't changed that much from the pay from 1950s. Executives were well paid, but the actual proportion of that pay relative to the average worker was not so different. Congress started to change some of the ways in which they looked at pay. They were trying to look at golden parachutes. There were some changes to taxation. And the idea was they wanted to make sure that executive pay was in alignment with their company's overall performance. With those changes, and then some further changes in the 90s and early 2000s around Sarbanes-Oxley, and then the Dodd-Frank Act in the late 2000s, what actually happened was almost the inverse. Pay just started exploding. And the reason why it was starting to explode was because now CEOs were going to compare their incentives relative to other CEOs and what they were getting paid. So the marketability of their executive compensation became really important. So unfortunately, whilst the rules were being put in place for better governance, it actually meant that the C-suite got better paid as well. Either way, now as an enterprise seller, you have a wealth of information around your customer's business that you never had before the last 10 years, really. In the annual general meeting every year, every public company is sending out a proxy statement to their shareholders so that they can vote on the incentives for their company. And as part of that, you'll see information related to the overall executive compensation in terms of the short-term incentives, as well as the medium-term incentives and the long-term incentives, especially for the top 5 officers plus the CEO. We call these the named executive officers, the NEOs of the business. And the metrics by which they are measured on give you a lot of clues as to how those metrics are important to the organization as they trickle down. So let's jump in. Let's take a look at Starbucks and what does their executive compensation tell us? Well, the first thing I noticed was really they focus a lot on their net revenues. The second is that they focus a lot on EBITDA. Remember those two metrics that we covered in module 1? Well, those are becoming extremely important now for how executives are compensated at Starbucks. What we're also seeing is that there's another metric called relative total shareholder returns. That's how that stock price movement was going up and down. And so now as a seller going in, trying to go and help them to drive value in their business, you know that their executives are aligned around the relative performance of the share price, which is driven by, we talked about it earlier, the free cash flows, but really the metric that matters to them is revenues. They've got some specific targets there, and then also EBITDA and how much of that profit is dropping to the bottom line. You're going to find that these metrics are actually quite common, along with shareholder returns, in a lot of executive compensation. But go check for your customer, what are those metrics which matter to them most? Use the language as they use it. They talk about net revenues, it could be total revenues, it could be gross. Use the metrics that matter to them. Revenue growth, EBITDA, profit, shareholder returns. 3 of the most important metrics for executive compensation. What is the data telling us now around targets in here? Well, the great thing is we actually get to see what does Starbucks set as targets for a maximum payout. And we can see here that they got to get to about $29 billion in revenue for their executives to go get a maximum payout. When we go take a look at where they're at right now, about 24 billion, they've still got quite a lot of work to do to get there. Maybe it's going to be a super big recovery through the summer period, but that could be one of the biggest areas of weakness for them, helping them to improve their revenues to make sure that they can continue to grow and hit their maximum payout. Could be also on the profit side. How do they get to that 5 billion as well? But you're starting to see that you can use the data quarter over quarter for your target customer and investor expectations and align that with executive compensation to get a really clear picture as to where your customer is. Roll forward a year, maybe you're selling them a solution this year, maybe it's going to have more of an impact next year. That's also going to be important to them. They've set some executive compensation targets and it's going to step up and be similar to the investor expectations. So maybe it's going to be in the $32 to $35 billion range, helping them to go and drive to those targets. That's important. Now you know what expectations are from the street for their stock price to go up. Okay, so we've looked at these metrics. Now, it's not like you're going to be engaging the CEO and the CFO of Starbucks every day. The whole point is that these metrics trickle down into the organization. I like to call this then the pyramid principle. Think about the executives at the top, and then the layer down, and then the layer down, and then the layer down from that. As you get to the individual contributor all the way through the middle level of the management, ideally every company wants alignment in terms of their strategy and their overall incentive compensation, and they trickle that across the organization. So if you're engaging at the middle levels of the organization, you still have the right metrics, especially around the financials, to engage with them on. Now you can tie those back to some operational metrics, but if you can talk about the business case in terms of revenues and EBITDA, now you're hitting a really sweet spot because you're educating your customer to go higher up in the organization to their finance and their executive sponsors to get those bigger projects funded. If you can accelerate time to value for your customers, it's going to accelerate time to value in your deal cycles and get you bigger deals at a faster rate with more close rates. Hopefully now you've got a better sense for executive compensation and the metrics that matter. If you tie that back to the value driver framework in module 2, now you can start to see how all of these things come together and make it super easy. You might be thinking, oh my God, it's going to be really hard to go and gather all this information. We want to make sure that that's easy for you. So you have all of this data on the platform so you can see where the company's strengths and weaknesses are and where their executive compensation is and what are the metrics that matter. Hopefully all of that information is helpful for you so you can identify the pain and urgency with your customers and you can go and look into executive comp. Look for the DEF 14A or the proxy statement and you're on your way.